What's up, everybody? This is Stewie Koss, and we have a special edition of Freestyle Fridays. It's being pre-recorded, but it is still a freestyle because you get it for free. Um, I am here with Dr. Anna Abraham. She is a E. Paul Torrance Professor in Creativity and Gifted Education at the University of Georgia. And she's here to speak to us today about cognition as we kind of continue on this path. Last week we spoke with Dr. Bars Keith Cross. To a certain degree, we kind of touched on things about cognition, freestyle, and flow state. And that's definitely something that Dr. Abraham, I want to talk to you about today as well, because I know you have a little bit of research on flow and how that pertains to the actual neurology or the I guess you'd say neurology or neuroscience behind it all. So if you would be so kind, if you could give your own introduction as well, so that people can have a little bit more context as to what you represent.
Okay, my name is Anna, and I am from India. Originally, I'm actually started working at the University of Georgia in Athens. So I officially started there in April, but as of yet, I'm still in the UK because of COVID and the travel bans and so on. So I'm there as the Paul Torrance Professor for Creativity and Gifted Education, and I also have direct the Torrance Center for Creativity and Talent Development. And by training, I'm a neuroscientist and a psychologist. And so I've worked in different parts of the world, training in creativity and the imagination, but from different disciplinary perspectives.
Great. As we kind of discussed prior to this video, there's 16 bars that we're gonna definitely try to hit. I'm sure you'll probably knock it out of the park, just like all of our guests have in the past. So what we want to do is start with the first question, which we like to ask all of our guests is, we have this metaphor that we're trying to put out into the world. Everybody knows this metaphor called life is a journey, right? Everybody understands that because there's kind of some motion and movement. Everybody kind of understands the hero's journey and how that can apply to life and all those kinds of things. But we like to say life is a freestyle because we're rappers, but we're also kind of studiers of linguistics and even cognition and things like that as well. So how do you feel about the metaphor life is a freestyle? Do you feel it's accurate? Do you feel it resonates with you?
Right. Well, it's the first time I heard the metaphor. And so ever since I've heard it from the email that Alex sent me,
Sure.
I've kind of not been able to get it out of my head. So I'm always thinking, what is this? Why? And so it's a good metaphor. And I'm not sure if I can answer your question
Okay.
directly, but I think it resonates really well because of the word freestyle, because it has these two components in it. One of which is, let's say, style, which is, suggests a sort of defined pattern, constraints, restriction, a certain design, a certain purpose, a deliberate aspect to it. And it's just the opposite of free in some ways,
Yeah,
because
interesting.
free suggests spontaneity, um, breaking away from constraints, breaking away from limitations. And so, as a word, it's a very powerful word. Just try sort of what one would call an oxymoron, I suppose, both
Yeah,
sort of
I can see that.
opposite aspects together. And I think if you have a good life, life is probably a freestyle. So that's probably what we should be going for, because it is about occupying that space between spontaneity and deliberate action, because having only one or the other is possibly going to lead to chaos or boredom.
Mm.
So in that sense, I think that's probably how it would resonate with me. As of yet, I think, well, it is, there's something about it that's very captivating.
Mhm.
And I imagine today, I think that's probably it. Yeah,
Yeah.
that's the meaning that resonates with me the most.
Right. And it's very interesting that you brought up, this kind of concept of oxymoron, because it's almost, I mean, if you replace the word freestyle with oxymoron and you say life is an oxymoron, there is definitely some interesting stuff there because, different people's lives definitely reflect a certain level of that and some conflict and whether it's internal, external. So yeah, I definitely can see a very interesting conversation behind this idea of free and style almost kind of being oxymoronic. So Thank you for that. That's definitely a bar. So that you already 100, batting 1,000. So that's great. Um, so I wanna move on to neuroscience and more of kind of like your passions. So you study the neuroscience of creativity. So what got you interested in that field?
I suppose I've always been interested in the arts ever since I was a kid. Like I was obsessed. Like I think a lot of people just enjoy and admire the arts, but I was so steeped within, I didn't really care much about anything else, academics of all things not. And so it, but I didn't have quite the opportunity to pursue it the way I wanted it to. And then a kind of opportunity presented itself to me in a sort of in an academic setting that I
Mhm.
could do a PhD in sort of anything that I wanted to. And I thought, well, I would only really do a PhD if I could study creativity. And so it was, but it was at the time when it was not really being studied from a neuroscientific lens at all. It was quite a new approach.
Mm.
And it was just a combination of the right kind of interest coming at the right time, with the right kind of resources being there, and the freedom to focus on what I wanted to do. I have always wanted to do was just study creativity. Only that, I mean, I didn't even know neuroscientific obviously focus existed when I was much younger. But
Mhm.
at the time when I was looking into it, it seemed it was still rather new
Mhm.
and just extremely exciting in terms of all of the unexplored territories there were to get one's head around. Really.
Yeah, that's amazing. So we have a pioneer in our midst. So that's great. And it tends to be that creativity is almost like a pioneering trait, but in and of itself. So it kind of lends itself to that. So that's amazing. What part of I'm sorry, part of what we do at Life is a Freestyle is try to answer the question, what is freestyle? So we already talked about it being kind of an oxymoron, but digging deeper into that. So can you tell me what is creativity and how does creativity relate to freestyle?
Um, that's the easy part, perhaps. Creativity is quite simply defined. I mean, the element that is most essential to it is originality, um, creating something new, creating something novel. And that involves freeing yourself of the way your preconceptions of the way things are. So, in that is a sort of freeing away means that you have to rely on your spontaneity, dare to go into areas where people don't normally venture, or maybe that might lead to failure. So it is about taking it to an undefined level. So originality, novelty is at the heart of it, but of course it has to make sense in a specific context. Here's perhaps where the style comes in. So you can't just say something completely random would not be really creative. It might be
Sure.
novel, but it's not really creative. It has to sort of fit or be meaningful in a particular context. And what is meaningful is perhaps, the constraints of what works in a particular situation. So I think freestyle is quite easily linked to creativity because of this duality is inherent in creativity, the novelty aspect, as well as um, the need for this idea that you have to for it to resonate with others, and it can only resonate with others when they see how it fits in the
Right.
context that you're specifying it in.
And we talk about constraints a lot at SOSA as well. And constraints are they're something that, almost pushes you to create something beautiful within those constraints. And so the free aspect, right, is you're kind of free. It's like there's an asterisk next to free. So there's definitely something there about creating something beautiful in a free way, but within a constraint where it has to be perceived as such. It's hard
Yeah.
to tell where the beauty is if you don't have a context or frame of reference as to what is supposed to be kind of like the gauge or the spectrum of what beauty would be in that context. So it's very interesting as well. Um, there are many lenses through which creativity is viewed. You study it through the lens of neuroscience. You literally wrote the book on it, called The Neuroscience of Creativity. What is the importance of understanding the neuroscience behind creativity?
Well, I think it's a very complicated question, and I think everyone comes to it slightly differently. For me, it was about understanding create aspects of creativity that were unknown to us before.
Mm.
So creativity typically used to be studied as something quite different from other psychological functions. So the neuroscientific lens allows us to understand whether this is really something that is true. Is the part of your brain, for instance, that processes creativity, that enables you to have creative thought, completely separable, completely isolated compared to all of the other functions? We know now that's not true. We know, more interestingly, how it interacts with a lot of your other functions and how it's incumbent on them and dependent on them. And so it allows us to understand the richness of the experience of creativity, from whether it's mechanics or really understanding all of the factors that we need to be aware of. So in that sense, the lens has been incredibly helpful in my view. But it's a very difficult lens to apply because the language of the brain doesn't translate one-on-one to the way we think about creativity. So it's about, you can go down a lot of blind alleys, and it is about accumulating a lot of knowledge in order to sort of be able to discern the patterns of what's being thrown at us with all of these great techniques that light up parts of your brain and you think, oh, that's cool, that area. And now we're at a stage where we can make better sense of all of that. But I definitely think it's been extremely meaningful to try to get to grips with what creativity is, actually how we define it, what it means, and how does it relate to every other aspect of our psychological functioning.
Yeah, very fascinating that, we have, advanced technology in some ways, and in other ways, the funding for research or the kind of focus on certain types of research is still kind of in a nascent phase of understanding the basic kind of baseline functionality of, not only the brain and how it processes information, but how it actually creates information
Yeah.
when you're kind of trying to create something out of nothing, or out of the frame of reference that your imagination has. So yeah, we at SOSA have discussions all the time about how to measure certain qualities of rap, lyricism, and art in general, just creativity in general. So because art is not easily measured, can you tell me whether creativity can be measured, and if so, how? Like it sounds like because it's still in the early phases of really understanding how the mechanics of it all break down, and then also maybe what some of the I guess the initial the initialization of creativity, right? So is that stuff that you're at a point now in neuroscience where you can measure that, or is it still kind of just trying to figure out what parts of the brain are lighting up while creativity is happening?
It's a mixture of both, and then um, think I think the question is to think about how we measure, can we measure creativity? The question is, of course, what exactly is creativity across all contexts, whether it's music or visual art or literature and so on.
Even
Creativity is
conversation, right?
absolutely. So creativity is incredibly multifaceted.
Mm-hmm.
There's no one task that exists that explains creativity in all of its manifestations.
Right.
So when we study creativity, we're studying specific aspects of creativity that lends itself to measurement. There are other aspects of it that we can't hope to touch yet given the techniques we have or the measures that we have, because they don't tend to be very good at picking up on super spontaneous or unpredictable aspects of creativity. We have a pretty good estimation of sort of deliberate aspects of, if I'm trying to tell you, well, think of something, try to be creative on the spot.
Right.
That tends to be mostly what we do. But the idea that comes to you suddenly before you fall asleep, we know very little about that beyond sort of through indirect means. And so I would say there are many aspects of creativity that can be studied, that are studied, but there is no way that anybody can claim that we study all of creativity and that we can explain all of it.
Yeah.
And some of it has to do with the problem from the neuroscientific approach, at least, that a lot of the methods are not advanced enough to pick up on the kind of things that we're interested in because of the the poor signal to noise ratio, or just all sorts of the fact that people have to hold very still when these things are when they're imaging your brain, for instance. It really poses a lot of limitations for most aspects of creativity that involve a lot of movement, whether it's through voice, whether it's through actual bodily movement, and so on. So there are all sorts of limitations that come from the technical side as well.
Right.
And I'm sure the next, couple of decades will see enormous advances in the kind of techniques that will be developed that will allow us to get many, many steps closer to what we're seeking. But at the moment, we have both problems of not enough measures to measure everything we're interested in, but also the bigger techniques that we can use for the purposes of understanding what brain activity is telling us are also quite limited.
You mentioned a very important, or something that stood out to me was you said super spontaneity, or super spontaneous kind of brain activity. Can you elaborate on that a little bit more? Because I feel like is that like looking at things in the milliseconds range, or is there some part of the brain that kind of fires faster and then goes to something else, which is what's generally measured? How does that work?
Well, by spontaneous, I mean that let's say you're trying to freestyle a couple of bars, let's say. You don't know in advance of the fact if you're going to be successful at being able to do it, being able to do it well, being able to do it creatively. These are all different bars. I mean, measures of what you're trying to achieve. Yeah. And so one of the major problems of creativity research is, for instance, compared to other very complex functions, if I ask you whether you can if you know the capital of a country, for instance, you can say yes or no, I know that capital, and you can mention it to me. Like, it's just like retrieving a memory, retrieving your knowledge. Whereas we're trying to create something new, you're not retrieving for something new, and you're entering into a new problem space. And what we can't predict very well is when you will get there, when you will be able to successfully reach for exactly the patterns that you want to reach for. And suppose you were actually freestyling to some extent, and this can be go from being not very creative to being extremely creative, or very, you still don't know whether, in advance of the fact, whether you're going to be very creative at that particular moment. And so the problem of spontaneity is more that those moments that we are all aware of when we're trying to create something that seems to be very good predictors of creativity, or the unexpected nature of it, is very hard to deal with in a laboratory setting. When you're trying to say, well, sit down now, and in this half an hour, you have to have a couple of creative ideas. And do you know what I mean? So that's what I mean. Yeah, the pressure, and sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't, and sometimes you might have one good idea. And so we have all of these sorts of issues to deal with. And of course, a lot of the problems come with the fact that these are very often not ecologically sort of valid settings to be using it in. So most of the time when you're writing a poem or writing some lyrics, you're not lying supine in a scanner you're in the comfort of your home. You very often, the context is so important. People sort of create elaborate rituals around how they engage in creative ideation. Everyone's got their own system, but typically they have a system. Some people start very early in the morning, some people are sort of night owls. There's a certain amount of me too. Certain sort of ritualistic elements to it that obviously get lost if you study it in a lab-based situation. And of course, those aspects of the process of the context are also part of the process. So at the moment, I think what we need to go to at the next level is just sort of try and capture aspects of the context in and of itself. So if you can get to the point where the measurement tools allow us to carry it to, I don't know, a jam session and hook up a couple of people and it's discreet, it's not actually interfering with the process of making music, then we'll be in a really good, portable is there, but also portable exists already, and wireless and stuff like that. But very often I think that can be kind of, if you're trying to, I don't know, strum a guitar and you've got sort of stuff
Right.
that is recording off your fingertips. But I mean, more and more, there are ways around it, of course, but it's just parts of the process that are very spontaneous, that tend to occur in unexpectedly. Those are very hard to measure in a way that's ecologically valid, if you know what I mean.
Yeah, yeah. You definitely dropped some bars there for sure. So as we continue on, I want to kind of switch topics, or not switch, but kind of, reposition a little bit. We've had guests on the show that are computational artists and poets. So with a boom in artificial intelligence, and making kind of creative output with artificial intelligence, with computation and things like that, machine learning and art, that's being created by machine learning programs is growing in popularity. We have like the Travis bot, which is kind of like an AI, I guess, video game character, if you will, basically,
Right.
that is just kind of, rapping lyrics that are kind of downloaded to some database from, Travis Scott's catalog, and then kind of put together, or subject matters that are being picked and stuff like that. So stuff like that is growing in popularity. In your expert view, can a machine by itself be creative? And then on top of that, what creative role, if any, does a human play in computer generated art or poetry?
Well, as far as the formats of AI-based kind of forms of creativity that I've seen, if we think about the definition of creativity as producing something novel, and that makes sense, that's appropriate or fitting, then a lot of what you see meets that criteria. And then you would have to say, well, machine creativity or AI-based forms of creativity are real. And I don't think that's is really a disputed thing anymore, as far as I know. The question, of course, is the other question that you asked, which is how much is the designer element in it, and other ramifications of that. But some people would say, well, actually, what's really important for something to be creative, so Margaret Bowden pointed out that it has to be intentional. And then the question is whether you can ever reach that conclusion that, in current form, at least, that any program is intentionally creating this. The intention is not from the machine, it's not from the program. The intention is driven by the designer. And so, as at least so far, it is. I don't see how you can override and say that a machine can be created without thinking of a designer.
Right. Somebody got to push a button.
Somebody,
yeah.
Well, someone has to. It's more than that. It's assumptions about how creative ideas are generated, assumptions about how to create novelty, assumptions about how to put things together, suppositions about what counts as satisfying or not satisfying.
The fidelity of the creative output, like the creative process and the output.
Exactly. So the algorithms are not making these decisions on their own. Someone is telling them what properties count as good fits, and that is all the designer. So the intention still comes from the designer. So then you do have a blend of, it's obviously the AI-based form is obviously doing a lot of incredible, computations to come up with what it is. But so from what we see so far, you can't discount the designer's role. So it's actually an amalgam of both. I know it's always peddled as something being purely, artificially created, but I think it's impossible to undercut the other side. And I think as long as there is an intention that is from somewhere, you might think, well, is this just another tool to create it? How is this different? And the interesting question is, how is this different from a guitar? How is this different from, you can just sort of pull it apart. Any tool that someone uses, and the context of music, a lot of, production level tools are used to, change, put sounds together to create a certain atmosphere, change the way people sound and so on. So there is a lot to think, well, if you say, well, if the minute some manipulation goes in, it's not human anymore. I think, well, everything is so widely engineered now. So I think those sorts of problems are those sorts of issues are really interesting to think about and talk about. And but I think for me, the interesting thing about this debate is that it's actually not super relevant to human creativity.
Right.
I mean, I think machine creativity is, and AI-based forms of creativity, all of that is interesting for all of these questions. But even if there are artificial systems generating art and poetry and stories, this has no real impact on why you and I are creative.
Not at all.
Because you have a drive, your creative drive is why you are creative, because you feel the need to create it. So I think that part of that discussion, so a lot of people fear artificial creativity, and I don't fear it. I find it interesting in terms of, oh my gosh, what's happening, and where does the role of the designer, what is all of those sort of philosophical questions, very interesting. But I think it doesn't really, I'm not sure if it really represents how human creativity takes place. It doesn't really tell, it's not necessarily derived from what we know about how human creativity transpires. And also, it's not really going to substitute it's not going to substitute creativity, as there's a lot of sort of fear about our AI and taking over jobs and so on. And I think it's a real danger in other fields, perhaps not for creativity as much though, because the drive is different. The drive is to find your own unique voice.
Express your humanity.
Your voice is your voice. I don't have your voice, and you don't have mine. So that's always there. And another thing, of course, is that human creativity is extremely flexible. You do a freestyle today, and you can decide tomorrow you want to be a visual artist. That level of flexibility is not there, in artificial systems. And I think that's something about the drive of, and then tomorrow you can decide to do, just try a new recipe. Like, there are so many ways in which we can be creative, and it's so instinctual, a part of who we are, that the artificial side is more like a game to me. It's like, oh, that's cool,
but it's self-contained and it can be turned off, and and once it's turned off, there's no ethical ramifications to that, because the purpose of it, like you said, it's a tool, so it can be used or not used, and humanity continues on. So regardless. Yeah, very interesting. And I think one of the things that people may be afraid of when they think about artificial intelligence and its capacity to create, maybe just how prolific it can be, because one of the things that you were mentioning is kind of the mechanical side of robotics, machine learning, and stuff like that, where you have these assembly lines that are creating cars and things like that, or like these large structures that can just fly off the line. And as an artist, if if there's a robot that can paint 5,000 paintings a day, and it takes me a year to make a masterpiece, then where does that put me in terms of, like, from a commercial standpoint, or as an artist that's trying to actually put out work that's significant, if it gets buried under 5,000 pieces per my piece, of some robot doing it. So that may be something to be kind of wary of, but at the same time, like you said, there's definitely, if you can look at something and be like, that's definitely made by a human, because there's some heart in it, there's some human relatability to it, that's not just inputs and outputs and reference points and stuff like that, but it's actually kind of filtered through the heart, if you will, or the human kind of experience.
I mean, I don't mean to at all undercut the danger involved in to many people's lives for the kinds of situations in which that kind of art will be sought after. But there is uncreative, cheap art that is mass produced, there's always going to be a market for that sort of thing. I think it's actually going to be annoying in some ways, of course, but it might actually be really interesting in terms of what it pushes us as human beings to do further, to separate ourselves, because part of it is showing your unique voice. And if you have a machine producing 5 landscapes or 5,000 landscapes of slightly different hues, then you're kind of going to avoid that topic, and you're going to try and do something that I think it will push us to push our boundaries, and that might lead to better creativity for humanity as a whole. At least I hope it will.
Definitely can agree with that. So, so when it comes to this idea of, you know, the humanness of creativity, do people have conceptual metaphors stored in their minds as like archival monolithic visualizations when it comes to where they're creating from? How are these inactive concepts that are these metaphors so easily accessible when referenced using imagination? Because people will think about something and immediately they'll go to a memory, or they'll go to you know, a dream state kind of imaginative way of seeing something that is their style of imagining something. So where do those things kind of sit?
Can you give me an example? Because I'm not sure I fully understand.
Like, if I come up with a metaphor that has to do with the ocean, right? So like, I'm a rapper, I can flow like the ocean. So why is that ocean flowing metaphor? Is that sitting somewhere in my head, or am I always making it out of scratch every single time from like different referential points in my mind? You know what I mean?
Well, I think metaphors are. I suppose I'm thinking about all of the different aspects that you're saying: the metaphor, the monolithic aspect, the visualization aspect. But I think if there are powerful metaphors that we use to guide the way we think, I don't know if you're creating I mean, the metaphors in your mind, so it would be hard to see how you would reimagine it every single time. However, I think what it possibly can be is a sort of anchor point to which you hook all sorts of associations. So if you're gonna, you know, if you're gonna, it's like an attitude that you take with you, and you think, well, I'm imagining this is what it is. Where if the kind of person who is very taken with whatever metaphor that they're attached to, you can sort of expand the meaning of the metaphor to include, you know, everything can be seen in that light, right? It's like when you're and that's just trying to find the conceptual link between whatever else is out there that you're looking at and your metaphor, and then things that don't fit you kind of ignore. So then it becomes even more heightened. So I think if you have a good metaphor that has all sorts of conceptual hooks in it, to which you can hook a lot of very other interesting ideas, then that's great. That will work very, very well. Because if you think of, you know, life as a whether it's a metaphor of life as a freestyle or the one with the ocean that you talked about, there are many aspects of that. Like the ocean is an expansive concept. It's not just a body of water. It, you know, immediately it's teeming with life. It's kind of mysterious. It's most of our world. So it just lends itself to be able to chain a lot of associations there. So and if you're kind of the person who's free associating, and you know that those things can be very powerful, and it's important then to have perhaps a powerful metaphor or a expansive metaphor that you can use that will lead you down the right path. It's like kind of having a mind map of a sort, you know. Or these what do they call these memory castles that people build their minds? What are they called? Memory palaces. Memory palaces.
I haven't heard of that.
It's how it's like these super memorizers who can like so that you train your mind to take on way more information than it normally could by visualizing things in a very spatially rich manner that allows you then to recall your memories of a particular situation in a very vivid manner, in a very accurate manner. So it's an age-old technique from the ancients of creating a so-called palace, I think, a memory palace. Again, but that's a kind of metaphor. You think, well, which place do I know very well? My childhood home that I grew up in. Okay, when I'm trying to memorize something, I'm going to associate this thing that I need to memorize with different spatial features or hues or whatever. I'm terrible at this. I have no idea how they do it, but it's, you know, so that's a way of saying, well, I'm going to take something that is alive and really, really expansive, and then I can use it in a way as to guide my memory or my creativity or whatever ability it is there. Sometimes it can be mental reserve, you know. a way to feel strong,
Mhm.
in times of incredible challenge. So I think it depends, of course, the kind of metaphor that you have.
Sure.
So that would might make the biggest difference.
Yeah, it's like when people talk about happy places, right? And something
Mm,
that they can kind of use to keep, like you said, to kind of persevere through a very tough moment or something like that. So yeah, it's like a mental GPS almost of like, let me find this referential point that sits within this kind of map of whatever it is that I've structured or constructed for myself, so that I can just drop the pin at that point and then just like look around on the street view and see what's
very
around me.
cool.
Uh,
Yeah, I was thinking more like a scrapbook, but yeah, an all
that too.
expansive scrap. Yeah, but yeah, the GPS thing is cool. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah.
Hmm.
And like you said, everybody, is different and exercises their humanity differently. So the way that they may visualize may be, unique to them. And so, I mean, obviously there's all these metaphors that are common amongst all people. People talk about like baseball a lot in America, and
Yeah.
how it relates to all these different things and stuff like that. But yeah, we could talk about that all day.
Yeah.
But that's very fascinating to me, because it's definitely something that it's like the kind of beginnings of your imagination. Like what is the platform? What is the operating system upon which your imagination kind of speaks to you, so to speak. So that's very fascinating stuff. So let's talk about flow. Flow is a term that is commonly used to describe one's rapping ability. What does flow mean in cognitive science, and how does it relate to creativity and freestyle?
Cool. Can you tell me exactly what it's referred to in rap? Like what
Well,
flow is
so
there?
there's flow state, and then there's
Okay.
flow, right? So being in the zone, I think, is what people would call flow state, and then
Exactly.
flow by itself when you rap, depending on who you're talking to flow is almost like it's a verb, it's an action that you do where you're literally just, it's a stream of consciousness coming out of your mouth, or coming, you're
Yeah.
producing the stream of consciousness that from wherever you get it in your mind, or from wherever, whatever influences you in your surrounding environment. But it's literally just kind of, I don't want to say
Yeah.
diarrhea at the mouth, but it's literally just coming out of your mouth with whatever you have.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's very similar to both concepts, especially the first one
Mm.
that you mentioned. Flow states are fascinating and apply across many domains of human activity. And what seems to be common is that it's a sort of state of feeling completely immersed and absorbed and engrossed in what you're doing. There's a sort of loss of sense of self-awareness, or at least a
Mm.
reflecting self. You're not
Hmm.
really thinking about what you're doing in a sort of cognitive way. So there's a sort of temporal blurring. You lose sense of time. It's a very it's a greatly rewarding sort of autotelic experience, is what's called the and it usually happens in situations where there's a kind of ideal match between the challenge posed by the context you're in
Hmm.
and the skill set. It's kind of perfectly matched.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's not too hard, it's not too easy, and it's very hard, and that would allows you to get into the zone and just almost effortlessly do quite remarkable feats. So it's sort of how you understand it is where action and awareness kind of just get mashed up together,
Okay.
get and just blend. And so it is that very special place that you can't kind of wander to whenever you want, right? I mean,
Mm.
it's the kind of, when people say they really want to get in the zone, or they hope that when they do this gig today that they will get into the zone. That they want that because they want it is a. I think when it comes to creativity, that space is kind of unique in terms of the insights that you get, or the level of productivity, the level of meaningfulness of that experience to your process. And so any highly creative artist that I've spoken to is always about, if there's something that brain research can do for them, please tell us how to reach the zone faster,
Yeah.
quicker, and can we stay there longer.
Right.
It's one of those mysteries. We know when you're in the zone, but you don't know when you're getting in, and you don't quite know how you fall out of it either.
Right. It's funny. There's the fantasy story of Limitless, the movie, and the TV show, but that the movie is pretty good in that it's kind of like, exemplifies this idea that you can actually access all of your mind, and not only can you access all of it, but while you're in it, you're in that flow state. You're literally in the zone the entire time,
Yeah.
and like, I mean, obviously, pharmaceuticals may not be the best way to go about doing that, but just the fact that the concept was kind of explored in that film was very very interesting. So if somebody is artistic or creative, sometimes they're labeled as right-brained. Why is this, and is there any truth to the left-right brain dichotomy and how it relates to one's creative ability?
Um, the the idea of the right brain is a sort of meme, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's extremely powerful and it will never go away. And that's, I think, because I think the more I think about it, I mean, my view on it has sort of been gradually sort of gained maturity over time. The simple answer is, of course, is not if you say the right brain is the creative brain,
Mm-hmm.
that's too simplistic and
Mm-hmm.
that's not the way the brain works.
Okay.
However, it's very interesting to me. I'm still interested in why this idea gets perpetuated and why it's so strong. And part of it is very historic because the early sort of nascent phase of brain research, I mean, we're trying to understand what parts of the brain are doing what. There was a huge focus based on the type of techniques you had available, was on the focus on all you could really see a lot of was the left or the right is involved in something. I mean, it was lateralization, laterality or dominance of one hemisphere over the other was the big buzz thing to look at, because you couldn't get much finer detail in terms of what was going on unless you had people who had lesions in certain parts of the brain. And so, but you could do all sorts of cool experiments where you project information to one eye and prevent it from transferring to the hemispheres, and you could do a lot of interesting studies with creativity like that. So the idea of the right creative brain came up as an answer to the left brain dominance, because for a long time the left brain was seen as the more important one. It subserved really important functions, including language, and if you were right-handed, the left brain was involved in dictating your ability to write, your motor functions on the right side. So it was
I'm left-handed, by the way.
Yeah. but of course, that was too simplistic, and as we found better techniques, you understood that the right brain actually does a lot of also in terms of language, is important for a lot of aspects of language processing that are metaphorical, and when you're dealing with sarcasm or innuendos and all of these really interesting aspects of going beyond the surface, the right brain was important. And so very slowly the shift became like, okay, if you're not doing something that's really logical and analytic, it involves the right brain, and became. But the earliest advocates of who were trying to point out the importance of the right brain, they never said that the left brain is not important. They just stated that we're completely ignoring this function here, and this whole part of the brain is really important for these sorts of aspects of our psychological functions. But over time it just got sort of simplified to being talked about as the right brain. But I think now the idea is, when we think about, everyone has like these, we all think of the world in sort of black and white terms, right? Sort of, it's this way, people are like this or like this, so the situation, we love doing that sort of thing. So if we think about, well, there's a boring sort of straight-laced kind of way to look at the world, and if you're going to try and be creative and break the mold, you're going to have to do something different. So the left brain is sort of like, okay, really focused, really goal-directed, and so to step away from it means to take a metaphorical leap into the right. So I think it serves a metaphorical function now that's very important, and it's very useful to have in order to convince people of the importance of creativity and so on. But in its actual in its literal sense, it's too simplistic. It's definitely not. There's a kernel of truth, and that is definitely important, but you cannot say that it's the most important thing, because a lot of studies have shown that laterality really changes depending on kind of expertise. You're much more likely to use the right bilateral, your brain bilaterally, if you're sort of a novice at something, whereas if you get very you gain a lot of expertise, the more automated things become, the less the right brain is involved, for instance. So and it depends on what kind of functions you're looking at. So what really matters is what stage of what what magnitude of creativity you're looking at. If you tell me to freestyle on the spot, I've never done it, and it's going to, the way my brain would look and function would be very different from yours, because you have a wealth of experience in that technique. To compare both our brains, to say, well, look at both of them, they did a creative task and a non-creative task, and oh, look, her right brain was so strongly active, and his, we don't know it's very difficult to conclude something from that.
Right,
Because
that makes sense.
your brain has changed with all of your experience of working on this very complex skill. So it's much more complicated than the right brain is the creative brain. But I think it's as powerful now as it was ever before, because it serves a metaphor. It's a metaphor for going against the grain, and that's why it's and has its utility there.
That's amazing. That's amazing. I love it. So moving on to the next question, and we have about 15 more minutes, so I think we're good. We have only like 5-6 more questions. That's great. At Life is a Freestyle, we've discussed that freestyling has a balance between focus and diffuse thought. What is the role of focus or lack of focus in creativity?
Yeah, that's super interesting, because one of the oldest ideas about what makes some people more creative than others is that they have access to a more diffused attentional focus. The idea of focus and diffused way of looking at the world being both important resonates particularly now, because a lot of work that we look at now sort of it speaks to that idea. So and I think there's a lot so for instance, there's a new book out by John Cleese, the comedian, the writer, and he focuses a lot on this, and his ideas are also based on psychological research and creativity, of the open mode and the closed mode. And the open mode is where you have this diffuse, allow any idea to percolate, come up, don't control what you're trying to say and think. And the focus comes in when you're trying to sort of prune your ideas, make them better, throw out the ones that aren't really working, and so on and so forth. So the idea that both these modes, a sort of expansive mode and a focus mode are really important and central to creativity, is important in rap and freestyle, and also very important in creativity, has a long history in creativity theory and research, and still is present today. So we know that certain brain activity patterns, such as alpha activity, are good indices of a state of feeling drowsy, state of feeling defocused, and also a state where that is associated with creative ideation. So there's a lot of work, direct and indirect, that supports this link between a diffuse way of thinking, approaching the world, attentional control, being advantages for creativity, because it just allows you to look beyond the borders at something that might be potentially interesting, and allow you to have more ideas there. The precise nature of how it all works together is still up for grabs, but the fact that both aspects are important nowadays is seen as quite it's just seen as something that should be taken as fact now, that you have these two, the generative mode and the evaluative mode, and that they're both central to having creative ideas.
Yeah. And you mentioned the alpha state of kind of brain activity, and that's like the first step into dream state, right? So that's, as like lucid dreaming is something that I think some people are trying to get into more so these days. And it's almost like you have to have, that focused mode operating within that kind of that kind of diffuse, unfocused, creation that your mind puts in front of you or puts around you, so that you can kind of analyze what's going on and be present in it. So
Yeah.
there's definitely a lot of interesting stuff there with dream state. Um, that
Oh, yeah.
yeah. Do you
Yeah.
have
Lucid dreaming is super interesting, I think. And I think increasingly more now studied through neuroscientific techniques. And if you look at, I think I just came across one study quite recently, but that if you look at the brain activity patterns, it's like what you said, there's a focus, they don't show the normal sort of activities of, usually your brain activity sort of slows down when it's slow wave sleep, and then REM sleep will look like beta waves. And then
mm-hmm.
you in focus in people who do sort of who are able to do sorts of lucid dreamings, you have I think it looks a lot like the awake brain in
Mm,
many ways. Concurrently, a lot of the patterns fit that. Again, it's quite understudied in terms of
right.
both behaviorally and neuroscientifically. But it's one of those great avenues that are there to sort of explore. Okay, there are these few people in the world who
Mm,
seem to be able to do this,
right.
and in a predictable manner. That's
Yeah.
important.
Yes.
And so you can reliably then search for a signal there. And since I'm not just interested in the creative aspects of imagination, but imagination as a
As
whole,
a whole, yeah.
those occurrences are very interesting. Like, we've all had those sorts of dreams where you've been able to control it a little bit more. Like perhaps doesn't happen every night, but we know what that's like. We think, well, I'm very aware of this, and I'm going to remember this very well,
Mm,
and I have to remember this. And there's a certain kind of dream state that sometimes we're in, where we're extremely aware of the fact that this is a dream. And it's a kind of state where we think, well, if there are people who can do this, and I think there are people who try to train other people to do this, and so on. There are techniques that I'm not very familiar with, unfortunately. But I think that's definitely a state where we think we can learn more about the imagination. I don't know how much it can tell us about creativity yet,
mm.
because um, it's not a
It's not intentional per se, right?
yeah, and it's not like dreaming leads to better creativity. It's not
Mm-hmm.
that linear.
Mm-hmm.
So, but I think it's an important. But imagination is a very strong is central to creative thinking. So I think if we would understand how these different focuses can be used together, that might tell us a lot about how, in an awake state,
Mm-hmm.
I'm sure that there are like in the flow state, where you're sort of not aware but
Right.
hyper aware at the same time, doing all these amazing feats. That might be a good parallel there,
Mm,
to sort of see what happens, and
right.
if there are any sort of correspondences that are meaningful.
Nice. Nice. Um, okay, so mental creativity, uh, and I guess that's kind of a redundant phrase, but creativity seems to be a trait that's highly amplified in humans compared to other living things, and that's why I say mental creativity, because we
Right.
have animals that create a bunch of different things that we see as human beings as beautiful or architectural or anything like that. But mental creativity, the ability to kind of like you know go outside of your daily regimen, or go outside of your survival instincts or what have you, to create things for play or for just for fun or what have you, is it seems to be highly amplified in humans, other than other creative beings or other created beings, if you want to say that. What is the reason for the human
Um,
drive to create? And can lower forms of animals actually be mentally creative, and or is that just hard to even say?
yeah. Why are we creative is a big question that has many potential answers. From an evolutionary perspective, when people have, you know, posed all sorts of theories about why it could happen, why it has happened, there are many, many ideas there, including, for instance, that it was a way for us to figure out how to work together in a group context. Socializing requires a lot of reading of other people's minds, so to speak, intentions, being able to convince them, manipulate them, being able to do things together. And all of that requires imagination and being able to engage your own imagination to understand the way other people think. That's one. So with that comes the potential to use your imagination to come up with new solutions and so on. Problem solve. There are other ideas there in terms of saying, well, it's basically problem solving on hyperdrive. You had to create tools in order to deal with your environment, and then you get better at it, and then you make prettier tools, and then you automate things. So every aspect of it has been looked at, and whether you look at the social side or the scientific side or the artistic side, the evolutionary claims are that it has to do with A, responding to your environment, coming up with novel solutions, B, finding a way to stand out from the group so that you could get ahead. If you were able to produce make the knife that looked prettiest, perhaps, you would get more attention than others and so on. So there's a lot of speculation about how that happened. There's still another strand that says that this is some sort of it's linked to language and the fact that, and again, it comes down to communicating with other people. Why are we such a communicative species? Why do we have language the way we do? I think all of it sort of emphasizes the fact that we are in a group. So creativity is always seen as a sort of very often as a kind of solitary activity, or it's about me. But for me, I tend to think of it as it's me, but in a specific context. So you want to do something to stand out, yet you require the recognition of others in order to stand out in some sense.
So it's me for everyone.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a nice little dance between between being part of a group and needing to be part of a group and conforming there, but also needing to stand out and say, in order to, for the sake of expressing, for the sake of other benefits. Yeah. With animals, there's a lot of creativity in animals, actually. And typically that's seen and it depends whether you're looking at it from a sort of expressive aesthetic standpoint or whether you're looking at it from the problem solving standpoint. Both aspects are there. So there's lots of species that spend a lot of time trying to make beautiful, trying to, focus on their appearance or the appearance of their nests or the appearance of their surrounding and in a quite ornate manner in order to attract mates, for instance. There's a great deal of work showing this kind of aesthetic, the sense of you can't help but think this is something aesthetically, there's some aesthetic value there that they're trying to get at in order to show fitness, in order to attract a potential partner. And from the problem solving side, there's a lot of work that shows insightful problem solving in a lot of animals, especially, of course, on other apes, but also in certain types of birds. Crows are incredibly creative,
octopuses
oh my god, yeah.
Octopuses?
Yeah. No.
One of
those. Good question. Who knows? But they're extremely
cephalopods,
wily and intelligent and very creative. So I think there's no question that this is not a trait that is unique to us, and that it didn't evolve from, it evolved eventually and as an ability. But our species perhaps has come to embody it and expand on it so much because it has been something that has proved useful for us, has enabled us to survive, has enabled us to master the environment, has enabled us to progress in the manner that we have. And perhaps there was no such pressure for the other species in order to, to get ahead in quite that manner.
Luckily for them, some of them can fly and breathe underwater and see at night and other kind of stuff. So, couple more questions and then we'll wrap it up here. But I definitely think that we are probably well past 16 bars at this point, which is amazing. I
Okay.
love it.
Okay, good.
So you mentioned kind of the portability and kind of the natural settings of the studies of neuroscience and creativity and things like that. So Neuralink has been in the news recently. This is Elon Musk's brain recording or stimulation implant. He has claimed that his device will help to uncover the big neuroscientific mysteries like consciousness. What is your opinion in that? And is it possible to electrically stimulate a person's brain in a way that results in them being more creative?
Um, Lots of questions.
Yeah.
So is his is Neuralink? I don't know the details of the exact nature of this of what he has
Proposing.
been able to do. I mean, what he's been able to
Yeah,
do.
because actually, yeah, they have like prototypes and stuff.
Yeah, so I know that they've have a robot to put in to try and do it as non-invasive, with minimal sort of surgical sort of intervention as non. I mean, it is obviously invasive, but
Right.
to try and put something in, and it records signals. And okay, so as far as I understand it, it's so far it records signals
Mm-hmm.
from the brain of pigs that depending on where the electrode is, that the pig is responding to certain aspects of the environment.
Mm-hmm.
So that's kind of, I mean, I think it's what's probably cool about it is the fact that the size of the electrode and the size of the Neuralink device and the
Mm-hmm.
electrodes with it, and so the technical features are huge advances, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And but the fact of intracranial recording is not new, so that has been possible for decades, so
Mm-hmm.
in humans, and
Mm-hmm.
is used in humans. So that in itself, so I don't know whether he's proved his ability to stimulate, but even stimulating that is done in clinical samples on human subjects, for instance. I think, will it help understand questions like consciousness? Sure, why not? I mean, but again, a lot of people work on all sorts of,
Right.
brain interface kind of technologies. They've been around for a long time. So anything that tells us more about the brain will tell us more about functions of the brain, and, consciousness is one of them.
Mm-hmm.
I don't, so I think that's, it's if it's going to tell us a lot about how the brain works, and it's super useful. How it relates to other technologies out there, how it, there are all sorts of ramifications about the ethics of it, how
Yeah.
it'll be used, and so on. And those are things that I think need better answers. Whether stimulating, I mean, I think when you stimulate, the stimulation of functions, even for non-creative functions, is a really hard problem.
Mm-hmm.
And you can there's a lot of work that shows that if you, I mean, even now, if you go to TMS and transcranial magnetic stimulation sort of lab, and one of the first demonstrations they do is to sort of, with this magnet outside your brain, they stimulate it, and they can move one of the triggers is getting you to move a finger by this impulse. Yeah. So there are certain parts of your brain that if you stimulate it, you can get a really precise, reliable type of response that is pretty straightforward, I would imagine. But creativity is really complex. And so there's no one region of the brain, for instance, there's
Right.
no specific activity pattern that is absolutely unique to creativity. Not at all. Yeah. If anything, brain research has shown us how it's so intertwined with so many other abilities.
Right.
So I would find it very, I don't think a simple, that kind of system, where you have one tiny coin sized thing with a few electrodes,
Probably an array. it'd probably have to
Can
be,
do.
right?
You have to have a completely different setup, working at different level, like, and then we can talk. But
Yeah.
and then we
And
can
then
talk
the
about how it
ethic,
can improve any function. Like you could
right.
probably allow you to fly even. I have no idea, but it's just no, it won't. But it could be. But people are. I think we're so far away from those kinds of advances. But if we could even just get be able to read signals. I mean, recently only you've been able to sort of read motor intentions from pure brain activity patterns that can now inform a robot arm to
Right.
move something to a person who's unable to use his limbs. That's pretty recent stuff. So if once we get to all of those sorts of once we get a clear idea of how those sorts of functions, we know how those functions work. Another idea is how to stimulate them in the right way in order to get them to work in a precise fashion, how to engineer devices that are usable, that if it's in my head and I can move around and say, oh, I need to type faster today, stimulate my fingers, please.
Right.
For it to be a sort of cyborgian dream where I just need an implant and I can, like in the Matrix, like I just need something uploaded and I can do it. It's probably what the final frontier for a lot of people in the who are doing sort of AI research.
Gotta learn that kung fu.
Yeah, but I don't mind that at all. But I think we're quite far away from it, and that's because there are very few studies that have been done in terms of stimulating, in terms of creativity. A lot of the techniques we have are not really, they've come up with. There's a lot of criticism about sort of electrical stimulation. There's very few with magnetic stimulation that have been done. I think there's only like 1 or 2 studies in all of creativity. It's a mystery to me why this hasn't been done yet. But the one study that did do that showed some improvement in drawing ability, but only in like 3 people, not the entire sample, for instance. So it's not really reliable. So there is. I mean, I think if you stimulate something, whether it's physically or through behavior, there's a lot of work that shows that if you train someone to do creative tasks over time, their brains change. I mean, we know this, like learning changes your brains. And there's, if you look at, there's a great study from 2015, I think it was Alexander Schlegel, who studied art students, over a course of like 10 to 12 weeks. They did a course on drawing, essentially, and their brains were compared to brains of students who didn't do any sort of art course. And within those 3 months, you had all sorts of changes. There was white matter changes in the frontal lobe and prefrontal lobe in the trained group. So there was that means there were structural changes in the brain. There were functional changes. So the activity patterns of the motor areas, certain motor areas in the brain, the cerebellum and I think it was the motor cortex, could be dissociated between the artists and the trained artists and the non-trained ones. And so it's very easy to provoke changes in the brain. The question is, of course, about how precise it is, how long these changes stay for, whether these sorts of changes lead to actual creative output, sustained creative output, and so on. So far, I think we're really far away from any sort of reliable way of stimulating creativity in a manner that, like, it would be great to think, well, I need a creative idea today.
Right. I gotta get over that writer's block.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I need, that's the ideal situation, and we're quite far away from that. And maybe, I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing, but we're quite far away from that so far.
Yeah. And, I mean, personally, I would take it to the spiritual level as well. The meditation, the kind of, metacognition and stuff like that we also haven't studied, and trying to see if there's any links, or if there are not any links, how important is it to kind of go down that rabbit hole as well.
Yeah.
So there's definitely a lot that, like you said, we still have to understand and still have to study. So you being a pioneer in the field of neuroscience as it pertains to
very
creativity.
Kind to say that. Go on.
Well, I mean, the fact that there isn't that much work being done, and you're doing some of it, you know what I mean? Like that kind of puts you in a pioneer kind of position, because the studies that you do are adding to that knowledge base that we can then kind of leapfrog from ultimately one day into chips that allow us to fly and stuff.
Please, wouldn't that be great?
It'd be dope.
That's what we need. Yeah.
Yeah.
Chips that get us to fly.
Yeah. Right. Made by Lay's. No, I'm just playing. Do you have any? Okay, so this is the final question. We've been asking everybody this as well. Do you have any post-COVID plans? Because we know you're in the UK right now, but you are based in Athens right now, Georgia. In terms of
work-wise, yeah.
Yeah. So, obviously, I'm sure you want to get back home. But are there any other plans beyond that you are trying to wait for COVID?
Post-COVID. Okay, I have to put on my optimistic hat then. It's just,
it's coming one day.
Eventually.
Eventually, yeah.
Eventually, yes. I don't know. I'm kind of looking forward to seeing how it will. What would go back to normal? What could go back to the old normal, and what will stay in the new normal? I'm very curious about how things will change. There's a lot of. I was just reading an article today about how workplaces are going to change forever, right? Like, because the new normal has shown that a lot is possible, but just getting people to work at home. So that's going to change the social fabric quite a lot. And so that's going to be interesting to see how people's practices change, and if they take more time for themselves, if they, all of that. I think the whole sense of having to stop and change gears. It's always good for creativity to change your frame of reference and to change the way you look at things, and that always informs and feeds your creativity. So I think I'm interested. It'll be nice to see what happens in the next 5 years or something. The aftermath of this crazy period in terms of what it leads to in terms of creative output. I'm quite optimistic there. For my own self, I'm looking to not be in a state of limbo and to finally arrive at the place that I'm supposed to be in physically. I'm very excited about, starting properly and teaching and getting back to a normal. I'm actually really looking forward to getting back to teaching students and face-to-face and doing a lot of studies in the context of education. I do want to be able to use the kind of insights I have to try and understand, particularly across the lifespan, not just young people, but because I think we focus too little on adults post-education. It's like, oh, how do we get them to be super nurtured at this time? And you're 18, out of here, we don't care about you anymore. Right. And this is a huge failure to, in my view, to maintain people's creative potential and to make sure and to understand how it changes with age and within context and so on. So I hope to be able to do more to understand just the pattern of how creativity gets shaped and changes over time, and to really understand across the lifespan how this works. In Athens, I think I'll be a perfect place to get that kind of work done. To also understanding it in different contexts, from the scientific side, artistic creativity, scientific creativity, social creativity, which is not really looked at very much. And also to do a lot more sort of community-based outreach that is creativity and imagination focused. So one of my big dreams, and I hope this will be happening, maybe not this year with COVID, but the year after, in the time to come, a sort of academic and arts sort of festival of the imagination, if you want, where we get, like a week-long sort of festival for the creative imagination, essentially, and really to look at it through all this, and that's a public event, so it would be then just about public engagement, getting people to come in, getting the community to come in, find out in ways in which they would like to have a focus on their creativity. I mean, a lot of the time researchers are we just sort of hold up in our labs doing things according to our own interests, but I would like to know what's important for the community out there. And in my few studies that I've done across the lifespan, I think, there's a lot of people are very interested in ideas, and they're interested in their own ideas, and they're interested in developing themselves, and they kind of need some guidance, or they need to be, and so it's a question of trying to figure out what infrastructure needs to be in place in cities, in towns, in order to support and nurture, the creative needs of your populace, really,
Right.
and then hopefully eventually also figure out a way to make schools more fun, and
Hmm.
using creative based practices to improve educational outcomes, actually. And there's a small amount of work starting on in that direction, and I hope to build on that. So there's a lot of plans, a lot I'm looking forward to, and I'm looking forward to just starting the new phase. I've never lived in the US, so that will be
Mm.
a first for me,
Okay.
and I'm very eager to start the new phase of my life, so hopefully it'll happen soon.
Yes, indeed. I mean, you've definitely taught me some things today, and I'm sure all of our viewers will enjoy being able to kind of glean some of these insights, because these are important conversations that, you know yes, scientists are kind of leading the way, and like that's why I use the term pioneer, because even outside of science you're not really having these conversations like this. So it's important that we have at least a group of people that are starting to have the conversation, starting to study things, so that as that trickles down to the kind of the general population, there are ways to kind of relay that information, so that it can be more commonly understood. But it has to start obviously in the laboratories, in the books, in the research papers, and in the kind of discourse. So pioneer. All scientists are pioneers in my mind. But people who have that ethical background, and want to kind of give people a brighter future through science. To me, that's definitely a pioneer. So that's why I say that. I thank you for
Thank
coming
you.
on, Dr. Anna
Thank you for having
Abraham.
me.
Do you have any plugs that you would like to get in here before we head out for the day?
Oh my gosh, just no, not really. Well, if anyone's interested in creativity, of course, there's the book that I've written, which is The Neuroscience of Creativity. But if you're interested in imagination as a whole, my edited volume called The Cambridge Handbook of the Imagination is out now, and it's an interdisciplinary sort of tome. There's 48 chapters with expert views from all sorts of disciplines, from archaeology and anthropology and psychology, neuroscience, the arts, everyone giving their take on what the imagination is. And it was hugely useful, I think, for anyone who's interested in human imagination as a whole. So, yeah, that's
Great.
that.
Dr. Abraham, thank you for coming on. Thank you for talking to us. Thank you for dropping all these bars. You can now go
My
back and tell
pleasure.
your colleagues that you just barred somebody to death. Uh, but yeah. Thanks for coming on, and
Thank you.
we will definitely love to hear from you in the future.
Yeah, likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Good one.
Have a good evening. Bye.